Learning objectives. After completing this digital module, learners will be able to understand the causes why the scope of new economic policy was taken in Indian perspective during 1991 and 1992. Understand the contribution and the major roles as taken by International Bank for Reconstruction and Development IBRD and International Monetary Fund IMF in Indian consequence during this transition. Learn how different financial reforms and deregulation in industrial sector did widen the road of liberalisation in India. Understand the concepts of liberalisation, privatisation and globalisation in combined perspective. Learn what are the basic rules and procedure of trades and investment policy reforms in India. Learn how in the era of privatisation, the public sector undertaking organizations did emerge with professional independence and business excellence. Learn how the scopes and sequences of outsourcing could derive a newer growth aspect for Indian economy during economic reform in India. Understand how in accordance with the World Trade Organization WTO, India was associated with multilateral trade agreements with other countries. Learn how foreign direct investments or FDIs and foreign institutional investments FIIs had turned the economic perspective in domestic level in India. Understand the salient challenges of globalization and about the shearing level of economic disparities and inequalities due to the adverse effects of liberal economy. Background of new economic policy. Indian economy during late 1980s. To achieve the goals of higher economic growth, social justice, poverty eradication and self-reliance, our institutional structure centered on the mixed economy principle where both public and private sectors functioned with their distinctive roles. The outcomes of control-ridden economy were the emergence of inefficiencies of the economy. It is said that control and scarcity create a vicious circle of low productivity. Scarcity demands control that brings in rationing in distribution line. This creates delays in the creation of new productive capacity and therefore lowers output and the demand-supply imbalances. Emergence of new economic policy. The main objectives behind the launching of the new economic policy or NEP in 1991 are started as follows. 1. To plunge Indian economy into the arena of globalization. 2. To bring down the rate of inflation and to remove imbalances in payment. 3. To build sufficient foreign exchange reserves. 4. To achieve economic stabilization and to convert the economic into a market economy. 5. To permit the international flow of goods, services, capital, human resources and technology. And 6. To increase the participation of private players in the all sectors of the economy. Stabilization and structural measures. The response to the crisis was to put in place a set of policies aimed at stabilization and structural reform. While the stabilization policies were aimed at correcting the weaknesses that had developed on the fiscal and the balance of payments fronts, the structural reforms sought to remove the rigidities that had entered into the various segments of the Indian economy. Liberalisation. Changes in export-import and trade and investment policy. The trade policy reforms in 1991 seem to have been guided mainly by the concerns over globalization of the Indian economy, improving competitiveness of its industry and adverse balance of payments situation. A first-generation reforms in 1991 aimed at to liberalize trade by reducing the import tariffs, eliminating the quantitative restrictions which resulting in yearly growth rates of around 7% compared with 3% before the reforms. The main features of trade policies or reforms are 1. Free imports and exports, 2. Rationalization of tariff structure, 3. Initiation of trading houses, 4. Special economic zones, 5. Export-oriented units and other agricultural export zones, 6. Market access initiatives, 7. Focus on service exports, and 8. Concessions and exemptions. Deregulation of industrial sector. The deregulation is the reduction or elimination of government power in a particular industry, usually enacted to create more competition within the industry. The government in India announced a new industrial policy on 24th July 1991, which sought substantially to deregulate industry so as to promote growth of a more efficient and competitive industrial economy. Tax reform and trade and foreign exchange reforms. Before 1991, India's overall tax structure had been broadly inefficient and quite inequitable. By international standards, the income tax rates had been high, and there was no VAT at the central level, except on a selective basis from the mid-1980s. The impact of economic reforms on foreign exchange reserves has grown faster in post-reform period. India's forex reserves become 7th largest in the world at the end of 2002. The high level of foreign exchange reserves has given rise to a suggestion in some quarters that this can be used to finance infrastructure projects. Privatisation. What is privatisation? India is a mixed economy with both the private sector and the public sector performing various activities in accordance with regulations. But the public sector was affected by inefficiencies and incompetence in a non-sustainable manner by 1991. The new industrial policy of 1991 contained several reform measures for the public sector. Some of them are selling off loss, making units to the private sector, inviting private participation in public sector enterprises or PSEs, and strategic sale. Some of these reform measures included privatization in a low degree. Disinvestment in public sector. During 1991, the government has adopted disinvestment and strategic sale of minority shares to private partners. It implied the full privatization as the concerned company's ownership was transferred to a private entity. But the main form of inviting private participation was disinvestment, which results in transfer of minority shareholding to the general public, at the same time the government maintaining 51% share. The sale of minority stake to private sector did thus enable the government to change the scenario altogether. Emergence of private sectors and public sector enterprises, PSEs. The most dominant sectors like dairying, animal husbandry, and poultry are totally under the control of the private sector at present time. Thus, private sector has played an important role in managing the entire agricultural sector and thereby providing the entire food supply to the millions. Public sector undertakings or PSUs may be classified as central public sector enterprises or CPSEs, public sector banks, PSBs, or state-level public enterprises or SLPEs. CPSEs are administered by the Ministry of Heavy Industries and Public Enterprises. As on 26 February 2018, there are 8 Maharatnas and 16 Navratnas in India. Globalization. Integrating the economy with the world. The series of reforms were undertaken by India during 1991 in order to take the LPG model, liberalisation, privatisation and globalisation with respect to industrial sector, trade as well as its financial sector aimed at making the economy more efficient. The term globalization refers to the integration of economies of the world through uninhibited trade and financial flows, as also through mutual exchange of technology and knowledge. Ideally, it also contains free inter-country movement of labor. Outsourcing in information technology sector. The globalization played a major role in scaling the industry where players from one part of the world moved to another part to do business. With them, they bring new thinking, perspective to the business, and they also learn and adopt for the processes where they move. At present, when the country's economy is showing signs of fast development and advancement in areas of science and technology, along with employment generation, this should suffice here. The global footprint of Indian economy. With globalization, the present industry player began moving across the globe for doing business. The movement ushered new thinking, perspective to the business, as also instilled awareness about the place where they moved. The developmental changes led to exchange of knowledge, business processes, and opportunities across the globe, enhancing development. Some of the Indian companies, however, are busy expanding their global footprints. They are going abroad to secure natural assets such as mines or oil fields, or intellectual ones, intellectual properties, or because their major markets are located in other parts of the world. World Trade Organization and India. The emergence of World Trade Organization. The World Trade Organization or WTO officially commenced on 1 January 1995 under the Marrakesh Agreement signed by 123 nations on 15 April 1994, replacing the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, that is GATT, which commenced in 1948. It is the largest international economic organization in the world. The WTO deals with regulation of trade in goods, services, and intellectual property between participating countries. Lowering trade barriers is one of the most obvious means of encouraging trade. The barriers concerned include customs duties or tariffs and measures such as import bans or quotas that restrict quantities selectively. From time to time, Other issues such as red tape and exchange rate policies have also been discussed. Bilateral and multi-level in India. Free trade agreement. A free trade agreement is an agreement between countries to reduce or eliminate barriers to trade. Trade barriers include tariff barriers like taxes and non-tariff barriers like regulatory laws. A free trade agreement or FTA is an agreement between two or more countries where the countries agree on certain obligations that affect trade in goods and services and protections for investors and intellectual property rights, among other topics. Criticism against FTA and WTO in Indian perspective. India has to continue its efforts to prevent several issues of developmental importance to be sidelined. Until this is done, WTO cannot impinge upon sovereignty of India. India has already marked red line in sectors such as agriculture by making it clear that there is no scope of compromise on its positions. Indian economy during reform. The emergence of foreign direct investment or FDI and foreign institutional investments or FIIs. India announced sweeping relaxations in foreign direct investment or FDI rules in single brand retail and other areas, besides allowing overseas carriers to acquire as much as 49% of Air India to help speed up its divestment. Overseas retailers can now delay having to meet the 30% local sourcing norms by 5 years, removing. India led other emerging markets in drawing overseas funds for its equities in March, with foreign investors buying $2.06 billion of local stock in the market, in which Bandhan Bank and ICICI Securities sold their shares locally for the first time. About 40% of foreign institutional investor or FII funds went into initial public offerings, IPOs, with the initial share, sales in the two financial companies acting as the primary drawcard. Growth in agriculture and employment generation. With the basic thrust on higher growth in food grain production and other agricultural commodities, increase in productivity and efficient use of resources in agriculture has received special emphasis all through the process of the development since independence. Sustainable agricultural production depends on the judicious use of natural resources, soil, water, livestock, plant genetic, fisheries, forest, climate, rainfall and topography, in an acceptable technology management under the prevailing socio-economic infrastructure. Reforms and fiscal policies. Fiscal policy has been a critical component of the policy framework pursuing since the initiation of economic reforms in India in 1991 to achieve the objectives of economic growth, price stability and equity. In 2004-2005, the Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management (FRBM) Act was passed to reprioritize the public expenditure being aligned with the revenue-led strategy of fiscal consolidation. Globalization and aftermath. Indian economy sustained development. The story of the Indian economy casts light on the gradual process of economic change in a democratic polity. The Indian experience did not resemble stories of rapid economic transformation in more authoritarian Asian political settings. A shift from state-driven economic self-reliance to regulated private sector promotion and competitiveness poses a challenge for accounts that have contended that the interests of the dominant coalition of industrialists, big farmers and the bureaucracy were locked in a manner that would make a change in the policy paradigm rather difficult in the 1980s. Widening economic disparities and inequalities. What happened to inequality in post-reform period India? The Gini coefficient measured in terms of consumption for rural India increased marginally from 0.29 to 1993-94 to 0.31 in 2011-2012. If we use income data from the National Council of Applied Economic Research, India Human Development Survey, the Gini coefficient in income, rural plus urban, was 0.52 in 2004-2005 and increased to 0.55 in 2011-12. In other words, inequality is much higher in India if we use income rather than consumption. Circular tragedy. Truth about power sector reforms. The powerloom weavers of Circular Textile Town in Karimnagar, district of Andhra Pradesh, who are yet to recover from the burden of FSA or fuel surcharge adjustments, are now reeling under the crisis of unemployment. There are around 34,000 powerlooms in Circular Textile Town. Among them, 15,000 powerlooms produce only polyester fabric, providing employment to 8,000 odd weavers directly and indirectly. However, following the non-supply of polyester yarn, several hundreds of powerlooms have stopped producing cloth and others are also on their way to closure. Summary. Let us summarize what we have learned. The high inflation rate and the shearing high of imports in the country seized the economic progression of the country. The World Bank and IMF presented the revival plan of Indian economy, where it was suggested to change its sustaining mode towards liberalisation. In domestic level, the industrial deregulation and private ownership were encouraged, and by the external mode, foreign investment and import liberalisation had been done as some salient steps of reform. In brief, globalisation can be termed as the final result of liberalisation and privatisation in a country, which in turn tries to align the country's economy with the international standard. The foreign direct investment, or FDIs, have widened the perspective of competition and quality output aligning with the global viewpoint towards Indian consumers. The objective of World Trade Organization, or WTO, is to secure a constructive trade regime throughout the world in order to ensure the optimum utilization of world resources.